Hi everybody, this is going to be an introduction to neuroanatomy. This is going to go over a wide range of everything that we're going to cover and is meant to be an overview and not to overwhelm you. We're going to go through everything again through the next 5 weeks in further detail. First, I want to start up with the central dogma of neuroanatomy. This is how everything works in our brain. You ready? So we start with sensation coming in from our body, either through touch sensation or somatosensation. Special senses like hearing, smell, taste, sight, and vestibular sensation or balance. And visceral sensation, which are the sensations that come in from our deeper organs. And then they all get centrally processed, turn into how we perceive the world around us, emotions, and then into cognition, thought, and action, what we decide we want to do with our body. And then it must go through the motor system to come out and express itself, either through skeletal muscle movement that we typically can control, and autonomic action through glandular secretion or cardiac activation. Those are the only ways that we can impact the world around us. And so everything that we're about to review is either a part of the sensory system, part of the central processing system, or part of the motor output system. Okay? We'll always come back to this when we're thinking about neuroanatomy. Okay? Let's look at the two parts of the nervous system, which are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made of the cerebrum and the cerebellum and the brainstem, as well as the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is mostly composed of the peripheral nerves and the muscles that the motor neurons connect to. Let's focus in on the central nervous system. And specifically here, we're going to look at the cerebrum, which is this big, larger part that we think of. And back here is the cerebellum and the brainstem. And typically when we think about the cerebrum, we have four main lobes that it is composed of. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The cerebrum is divided by different major fissures. This is the interhemispheric fissure, and our two hemispheres are divided by this interhemispheric fissure. The right side of our brain receives sensory information from the left side of our body, and of course controls the left side of our body. And the left hemisphere receives sensory information and controls the right side of our body. Here are a bunch of different spots that are worth mentioning. We're going to zoom in on each of these over the next 5 weeks, but just to give us a good summary. This is the central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay, this back of the frontal lobe, the first gyrus that I want to highlight, is the primary motor cortex. This is the part of the cerebrum that is the last stopping point before we send motor information to move the opposite side of our body, or contralateral side of our body. If you injure this side, gyrus, you will experience weakness on the opposite side of the body. This is organized according to the homunculus, or little person. Okay, so you can imagine that the organization of this strip, this motor strip of the primary motor cortex, is organized by parts of the body. Down here, if you injure this part, you would have weakness in your face. If you injure this part, you would have weakness in your hand and in your arm and in your torso. And then finally, over here, weakness in your leg. Similarly, this is the somatosensory cortex, where touch sensation is brought into the brain. Okay? And similarly, it is organized according to the homunculus. If you injure here, you would have numbness of the opposite side of your body in your face, numbness to the opposite side of body in your hand, and body, and then leg as well. So that is the organization of the homunculus, okay? And this central sulcus is really important because it divides the front of our brain from the back of our brain. And generally speaking, as a general rule, the back of our brain is in charge of sensation, bringing in information from our body, and the front of our brain is in charge of motor functions, creating movement and action. Okay, so going back to that central dogma, the back is where the sensory information comes in, and the front is where the motor production happens. Okay, we're going to talk about some other sensory areas, some other central processing areas, and some motor areas. Let's talk about some other sensory areas. Back here, famously in the back of the brain, is our occipital lobe, where our visual cortex is. It receives sensation from our eyeballs in order to create our primary motor cortex where vision happens, and it is separated above and below with the calcarine fissure. If you injure the visual cortex, you will lose vision to the opposite half of your visual field. So if you injure your left visual cortex, you will have a homonymous hemianopsia, meaning you won't be able to see the right side of your vision. And if you injure the right occipital lobe, you will not be able to see the left field of vision. Okay? Let's talk about another sensation. Here is your temporal lobe, separated from the frontal lobe by the lateral fissure or the sylvian fissure. And right over here is the primary auditory cortex, which receives auditory information. And if you injure it, you can get cortical deafness. Of course, right next to it is the language comprehension area, or Wernicke's area. So any auditory sensations that come in to the cortex, right next to them are deciphered into language. And that organizationally kind of makes sense. Right in front of these areas, right, is the language creation area or expression area, also known as Broca's area. So remember how we said that sensory stuff happens in the back of your brain and motor stuff happens in the front of your brain? So we can think of this as our sensory language area, where we bring in language sensation, and the motor area where we create language is in the frontal lobe. And these two areas communicate with one another very intimately. So we have talked about the auditory, visual, and somatosensory sensory areas, and there's one other sensory area, which is the olfactory bulb in the orbital gyrus right above our nose, and that is where olfactory sensation comes in. In addition, this is where a lot of emotional processing happens, and so this is why your sense of smell is so closely linked to memory formation and emotional processing. All of these sensations are brought together in our brain, right in between where we have somatosensation, auditory, and visual sensation, in this area right in between all of them in the back of our brain, which is called the sensory association area, where all of our sensations are brought together to create a picture of the world around us. If you injure this sensory association area in the parietal lobe, you will have what we call neglect. On the opposite side of your body, you will not recognize the world around you. So if you injure your left parietal area, you will have a right-sided neglect. It's a much deeper than just not being able to see on your right side, but you truly cannot recognize the world around you or bringing any sensations from that side of the world. Let's focus on some of the frontal areas that we have missed. And this is where we'll talk about some central processing areas and some motor areas, okay? So remember our central dogma, we talked a lot about sensation. Now we're going to talk about that central processing. And this is the prefrontal gyrus, where we have a lot of decision making and deciding what stimuli to respond to. And that is where, if we have an injury here, you can have an impairment of executive functioning. And deep down here in the central sulcus is our anterior cingulate gyrus, where a lot of emotional processing happens, right? All of the central processing where we use all that sensory stimuli that we received in order to create emotions. And so these areas are then communicated with the motor areas to create action. One other motor area that we haven't talked about yet is the frontal eye field. So just to reorient ourselves, a couple of motor areas that we've spoken about already are the primary motor cortex, which is in the very back of the frontal lobe, and right below here is the motor language area, where we create language, and right over here is another motor area which is called the frontal eye field, which controls our eye movements. this left side of the brain, our left frontal eye field, makes our eyes move to the right, and our right frontal eye field makes our eyes move to the left. So if you injure your left frontal eye field, you won't be able to make your eyes look towards the right. And so these knowing what each area is and what its function is going to be really important when it comes time to talk about pathology, and we need to localize where the injury to the brain is happening. Okay? Now, let's cut the brain in half. I want you to be able to see the hemisphere by itself, right? And you can appreciate, looking at it from the sagittal plane, that there are cortical areas in here down the midline of the brain. Specifically, the cingulate gyrus is a gyrus that we already pointed out in the last slide, and it is where the seat of a lot of the limbic system occurs, meaning where a lot of our emotional processing happens. Okay? So I want you to be able to see it in the hemisphere as well. Okay? Now, we're going to bring the brain back together, but what we're going to do is peel off the outer layer. Now, the outer layer of the cerebrum is covered in gray matter. Gray matter is where the cell bodies of all the neurons collect. The main gray matter area where a lot of the cell bodies in our brain are on the outer layer of our cerebrum, which is called the cortex. So the cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum, which is composed of many of the neuron cell bodies of our brain. Okay? We just peeled it off, and you can see that it's been made translucent, and we've revealed the white matter areas under it. The white matter is where all the axons are, and the reason that it is white is because these are all covered in myelin, and so they appear white when you dissect a brain. And these are where all of the tracts are that communicate between different areas of the nervous system. We're going to talk about the different types of white matter tracts. Okay? So we're going to peel off this white matter area, and we're going to reveal the deeper white matter tracts, just to highlight two of the main white matter tracts. Okay? For just as an example, this is the main white matter tract, the main tract of axons that connects the two hemispheres together, and we call it the corpus callosum. And right next to it is another white matter tract, another path where a lot of axons travel together to enter and exit the brain from our body, and this is called the internal capsule. Okay? So this white matter tract is composed of neurons that are traveling from one side of the brain to the other, from one hemisphere to the other, and this white matter tract, the internal capsule, is composed of axons that are traveling up and down, from the cortex down to the body, and vice versa. Let's cut the brain in a different way. We cut the brain sagittally before, down the middle, and now we're going to cut the brain coronally, so that we've cut away the frontal lobe, right? And we're leaving the parietal, occipital, and back of the temporal lobe and the cerebellum, right? So we've cut the brain in the coronal plane. And now we can look at the three main types of white matter tracts, okay? So axons travel together in tracts in the white matter. And the three types of white matter tracts are associative tracts, commissural tracts, and projecting tracts. Associative tracts are tracts that travel between different areas of the cortex. So for example, if you want to send an axon from this area of the cortex to this area of the cortex, you have to make a U around the sulcus, and that is where U fibers are. So U fibers are a great example of an associative tract, a small short tract traveling from one section of the cortex to another. Another famous tract is the arcuate fasciculus. I don't want you to know the name of it, but more importantly, I want you to know that that is how we communicate between the back of the temporal lobe, where the Wernicke's area is, that is the area of language comprehension, and communicates anteriorly to the bottom of the frontal lobe to Broca's area of language expression, right? So we understand language and we create language, and those two areas are connected by an associative tract called the arcuate fasciculus, okay? Another example of a white matter tract that travels between two areas of the cortex. A commissural tract is a tract that communicates between areas of the cortex not on the same side of the brain, but in the opposite hemispheres. And the main commissural tract is, of course, the corpus callosum, that dense band that we saw in a previous slide that connects the two hemispheres. Finally, projecting tracts are what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in the beginning, earlier parts of this course. And those are pathways that communicate between the cortex and the peripheral nervous system, up and down. Sensory tracts come from the body, from the peripheral nervous system, up into the cortex, and motor tracts travel down from the cortex down to the body. And those are two examples of projecting tracts. So there's one main motor tract, which is the corticospinal tract, traveling from the cortex to the spine. So that's a good name. And it travels down from the cortex through the corona radiata, through the internal capsule, through the cerebral peduncle, through the medullary pyramid. These are all one long white matter tract, right? Traveling from the motor cortex down to the spinal cord, and vice versa. We have the dorsal column and the medial lemniscus, which travel down from the spinal cord all the way up in these projecting tracts, projecting all the way up from the spinal cord to the cortex. There are three main projecting tracts we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in the beginning of this course. Those are the corticospinal tract, which is the main motor tract, and the two somatosensory tracts, the dorsal column and the spinothalamic tract. We'll talk more about those later. Let's cut the brain in a third way, not sagittally or coronally, but axially. I'm going to flip this brain around so you can appreciate how we've cut it. Right? We've lopped the top off of this brain, so we're seeing the bottom of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe and the cerebellum and the brainstem, and we've lost the top of the brain and we're looking down on it. The reason why I want to look at this now is because you can appreciate that we've talked about the cortex. Remember, we talked about those different cortical areas and what they each do? We also talked about the white matter tracts and where these axons are traveling, either traveling within the hemisphere or down the internal capsule or across the corpus callosum. But deep to all of those, in the very center of the brain, are more gray matter areas or gray matter nuclei. A nucleus is a collection of gray matter in the inside of the brain, okay, inside of the nervous system. And so in the central nervous system. And the main deep brain gray matter areas are the thalamus, which embryologically, technically, is not even part of the cerebrum, but is sort of its own little brain inside of the brain. And the three main nuclei that make up the basal ganglia, the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus, are all make up the basal ganglia, which are really important for motor control. And we're going to spend a lot of time in week 3 talking about the basal ganglia, okay? So I want to look at the brain now back in 3 dimensions and look at the basal ganglia and the thalamus in 3 dimensions. This blue thing is a fluid space inside of the brain called the lateral ventricle. I have it here, and we're going to talk about the ventricular system in a minute, but the ventricles are really important for bathing and keeping the brain working and bathed in fluid. I want to look at these deep nuclei. So again, we've peeled away the cortex, we've peeled away the white matter, and now we're looking at these deeper nuclei. Inside here is the thalamus. Right under the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is really important for homeostasis regulation, hunger and temperature regulation. And then we have these nuclei here that make up the basal ganglia, which are really important for motor planning. The putamen, the caudate, which is this long tail, as you can see, swings around. And right under the putamen is the globus pallidus, interna and externa. And you can see these 3 structures now in almost like we saw them in the axial plane. Putamen, caudate, and globus pallidus make up the basal ganglia. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the thalamus, because the thalamus is almost like a whole brain unto itself. So we're going to take everything away except for the thalamus, and I kept the lateral ventricle in for reference. Ready? We're going to peel everything away, and now we're just left with the thalamus. Like I said, the thalamus is almost like a whole brain unto itself, and each area maps pretty similarly to the cerebrum and cortex around it. We have sensory areas in the back, we have motor areas and central processing areas in the front. Okay, so remember that central dogma: sensory, central processing, and motor. Let's talk about some sensation. We have our ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial nuclei, which bring in sensation from the face and body. And so when sensation travels up from the body to our brain, it has to take a pit stop here in the thalamus before going up to the sensory cortex that we talked about. Similarly, when we bring in auditory information, it's got to pass through the medial geniculate nucleus before going to the auditory cortex. And visual sensation, when on its way from the eyes to the occipital cortex, needs to take a pit stop in the lateral geniculate nucleus. And this is where the early processing of visual sensation begins. Those three sensory areas all combine and join in the pulvinar nucleus, where all those sensory modalities are integrated together, just like the sensory integration association areas in the parietal lobe, right? So this is almost like a little brain unto itself. Two other areas that are important are the medial dorsal nucleus, which projects out to the frontal lobe and is really important for that risk-reward evaluation and executive functioning that we talked about in the frontal lobe, and the anterior nucleus, which is involved with basic emotional processing and is really intimately connected with the cingulate gyrus as part of the limbic system, our emotional system. Finally, here in the ventral anterior and ventrolateral nuclei is where a lot of our premotor planning, involved intimately in the basal ganglia system and motor system, happens. So you can appreciate how the thalamus is almost like its own brain unto itself. And in fact, when it developed embryologically, the thalamus was its own separate part of the brain. It's called the diencephalon, which developed by itself as its own brain. And then the cerebrum developed around it and is intimately connected with it. This is a great schematic of the thalamus, where you can see all of those nuclei together, and you can see how the sensory nuclei, the motor nuclei, and the central processing areas are all represented here in the thalamus. Okay? So finally, I want to talk about the ventricular system. And this is the end of the portion of this talk that involves the cerebellum and the cerebrum. Okay? The lateral so this is the ventricular system. Cerebrospinal fluid is the name of the fluid that bathes the central nervous system and is really important for maintenance of a healthy central nervous system. Inside of it is this capillary bed called the choroid plexus, which produces the cerebrospinal fluid. It's a capillary bed that takes the serum from our blood and cleans it out and creates spinal fluid. It is produced up here in the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles, of which you have two on the right and the left, join together and dump into the single third ventricle, which lives right between the right and left thalami in the middle of the brain. Then cerebrospinal fluid flows down through the cerebral aqueduct, which is at the level of the midbrain and the brainstem, down into the fourth ventricle, which is right behind the pons in the midbrain, right between the pons and the cerebellum. And then the fluid flows out into the surrounding aqueducts that surround and bathe the brain. So we'll talk a lot about the ventricular system later in week 4. And one last thing that I want to emphasize that I missed is to talk about the cerebellum, which is right down here. The cerebellum is its own separate lobe, not part of the cerebrum, and its main function is for controlling, coordinating, and balancing our body. Brings in sensory information, makes sure that we're balanced, and sends out motor information to help coordinate our movements. The central lobe of the cerebellum is called the vermis, which controls our midline axial movements of our torso. And so if you have an injury to the vermis, you might experience truncal ataxia. And the lateral zones of the cerebellum, the lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum, control our arm movements. Unlike everything else that we've talked about, if you injure your left cerebellum, you have discoordination of your left arm or leg, and if you injure your right cerebellum, you'll have ipsilateral right-sided discoordination or ataxia of your right side of your body. And when we talk about the cerebellum in depth, we're going to talk about why that is a reversal of all of the other crossed control that we have a lot of experience with the rest of the central nervous system. Now, we're going to talk about the brainstem and the spinal cord in a little bit more depth here. So the brainstem is like the stem of a broccoli that connects to all of the leaves above it, and it is the main way that the cerebrum communicates with the outside world, right? So if you were to chop off your brainstem, your brain would be able to continue to think, but you would be locked in there. You wouldn't be able to receive any sensory information, and you wouldn't be able to create any motor movement, right? You would be brain isolated inside of your skull, and you wouldn't be able to communicate with the outside world. The three main parts, as you may already know, of the brainstem are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. First of all, there is a really complicated set of rules that help make sense of the brainstem for those who are trying to memorize the different parts of it. It is called the Rule of Four, and I have it here. And what we're going to do is approach it in a bit of a different way. That once we review it, going back to the Rule of Fours might help you put everything together. But I want to approach it a little bit differently. First, I want to talk about the 12 cranial nerves that come out of the brain. The cranial nerves are nerves that enter and exit the brain directly, as opposed to the spinal nerves, which exit from the spinal cord. So there are 12 nerves that enter and exit the brain, and our brain controls those parts of the body directly. Most of the cranial nerves control functions in your face, in your head, and your neck, and we're going to talk about what they each do now. Cranial nerves 1, 2, 3, and 4 come out the highest, and they're numbered according to how high they come out of the brain. Number 1 comes out so high up in the brain that it actually exits from the cortex, from the cerebrum itself, and that is the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1, which of course is a sensory nerve, and some cranial nerves bring in only sensory information, and some cranial nerves only bring out motor information, and some cranial nerves have both sensory axons coming in and motor nerves coming out. The cranial nerve 1 is an olfactory nerve, only brings in sensory information, of course, sense of smell, and it goes straight to the olfactory cortex in the bottom of the frontal lobe. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve, which also goes directly into the brain to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus that we already saw. So it directly goes into the thalamus. All the other cranial nerves enter or exit from the brainstem, aside from cranial nerves 1 and 2, which directly go into the brain. Here in green is highlighted is the midbrain, as you can see here. The two cranial nerves that exit the midbrain directly are the cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve, which controls many of our eye movements, and the trochlear nerve, which also controls our eye movements. The oculomotor nerve exits from the brain anteriorly, as most cranial nerves do. The trochlear nerve is special because it exits from the back. As you can see here, it is the only cranial nerve to exit from behind the brainstem, and they both are involved with eye movement control. They are both motor nerves. They both exit medially from the midline of the midbrain. So if you injure the midline of the midbrain, the medial part of the midbrain, you may have difficulty moving the eyes, and that is true for cranial nerve 4 as well, which exits medially. If you injure it more laterally, you might spare and not have any weakness of your eye movements because they are very medial. And that's going to be important later when we talk about where different injuries occur. Let's move on to the pons and the cranial nerves that exit the pons. Cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 exit from the pons. This large cranial nerve here in yellow is cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve, which is a mixed sensory and motor nerve. Sensation from the, somatosensation from the face, meaning touch sensation from the face, enters through the trigeminal nerve from the upper face, the middle face, and the lower face. And it also has motor control of the jaw. So cranial nerve, you notice that it exits laterally from the pons, as opposed to the next one, cranial nerve number 6, which is the abducens nerve. It's our third nerve that controls our eye movement, along with 3 and 4, which came out of the midbrain. And the abducens nerve abducts our eye, makes our eye look outwards. And the abducens nerve also exits very medially. So far the cranial nerves that exit medially include number 3 and 4 and number 6. The rest of the cranial nerves exit laterally. The next two cranial nerves are cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve, which has some sensation. It actually brings in taste from the front of our tongue, and it also sends out motor information and controls our facial expression muscles, making us able to close our eyes and smile. And another cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 8, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve. It is a sensory-only nerve that brings in sensation from the cochlear and vestibular organ. This allows us to hear and allows us to experience equilibrium or disequilibrium, the sensation of balance. And those enter in through the bottom of the pons, right at that junction between the pons and the medulla. We're going to shift down to the medulla now. The medulla is now in pink. And the last three cranial nerves are cranial nerves number 9, 10, 11, and 12. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. This controls our palate and our movement of the back of our throat. And the cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is involved with a lot of different things, including laryngeal control and our voice control, but also ends up going down to our body and does a lot of autonomic control of our viscera, our heart, and our GI system, and actually has a lot of broader control. So whereas most of the cranial nerves really control our head and neck, the vagus nerve actually has a lot of control further down. A lot of sensory and motor control comes through the vagus nerve. Cranial nerve number 11 is the accessory nerve, or sometimes referred to as the spinal accessory nerve, because while we consider it a cranial nerve because it gets some contribution from the medulla, it also gets a lot of contribution, as you can see, from the cervical spine as well, and so it receives components from both, and it has motor functions only, and is in charge of moving our neck, shrugging our shoulders, moving our head to side. That is controlled by the accessory nerve. And finally, the last cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve, which controls our tongue movement. And you can see that this one exits medially from the brainstem as well, right? So we're going to talk about injuries to the brainstem and what happens when you injure the brainstem. Some of those injuries will happen laterally and some will happen medially. And that's why it's important to know where these nerves come out from. Cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, and 12 exit the brainstem medially, and all the other cranial nerves exit laterally. Now we're going to talk about each level of the brainstem and a lot of other things that happen at each of those levels. This is the midbrain, the top of the brainstem. We've cut away the deeper nuclei, the thalamus and the basal ganglia, and in fact you can see the opposite globus pallidus and putamen here on the other side, right? We've cut them all away so that you can see the top of the midbrain. It's shaped a little bit like Mickey Mouse. You can see the two ears of Mickey Mouse, and the reason why it's shaped that way is because you have these big bulges that make the ears. Those big bulges are the corticospinal tracts that form the cerebral peduncle. This is where all the motor information travels down from the top of the brain down through the brainstem and on its way to the spine, which is why we call those white matter tracts the corticospinal tract, right? So these are white matter tracts that bring motor information down from the brain to our body, and that's what these Mickey Mouse ears in the brainstem are made of. Another really important area of the midbrain is this area right in between the corticospinal tract and the rest of the midbrain. This is called the substantia nigra. If you were to actually open up and cut away a midbrain out of a human brain, you would see that it's very dark, almost black, pigmented, and that is where dopamine is synthesized. Dopamine, the chemical itself, is physically dark, and so it stains the substantia nigra. This is the nucleus where dopamine is made and is really important for control of the basal ganglia right above it. Another important area of the midbrain is the medial lemniscus. These are the main sensory fibers coming up from your body, from your spine, and these bring up vibration and proprioception, or position sense, up from your brain, from your spine, and we're going to talk about those tracts later. Here we have cranial nerve 3 nuclei. Cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor cranial nerve, actually has 2 nuclei. Remember how we talked about the oculomotor nerve coming out very medially, and you can see that the nucleus is here. It actually has 2 nuclei. It has the motor nucleus, which is what controls those muscles, of the extraocular muscles, and right next to it is the parasympathetic nucleus, or the Ehninger-Westphal nucleus, which controls our pupillary constriction. So cranial nerve 3 nuclei are very medial, and the other structures that we discussed, especially the corticospinal tracts, are very lateral. Right here is the cerebral aqueduct, which we talked about as part of the ventricular system. It travels right down the middle of the midbrain, and behind it are a couple of other areas. Surrounding it is the periaqueductal gray, which we'll talk about a lot in week 4 when we talk about pain integration and sensation and its integration with the emotional systems. So just mentioning it here, but don't worry about it yet. And then we have these 2 bumps on the back of our brain. We have our superior colliculus right over here, which is our vertical gaze center, and which controls our ability to look up and down, and our inferior colliculus, which is our auditory relay center, very integrally connected to the medial geniculate nucleus in auditory processing. Finally, down here is the nucleus, where all the cell bodies of cranial nerve 4 are before they come out into the trochlear nerve. So those are the main areas that I want you to know about in the midbrain. A nice schematic is right over here, where you can see each of those nuclei highlighted here. There are some things that I didn't talk about, like the red nucleus and other areas, and I don't want you to know those. I want you to know the ones that we just talked about. Not that you need to memorize them all up front right now, but just so that you have heard them once here, and we'll talk about them over the next weeks. Now let's look at the pons. The pons is the next level right below here, and we're going to cut away the medulla. We're going to cut away the midbrain, and we've chopped off the midbrain. You can see the aqueduct that was traveling down, and it's going to be flowing down into the pons, where the 4th ventricle is hidden inside of. Let's look at different areas here of the pons. Up here up front, just like in the midbrain, right above it, is the corticospinal tract that comes down the anterior pons. These are the motor fibers coming up from the brain all the way down through the pons, and they'll go down to the midbrain, to the medulla and the spinal cord. Over here in the very middle is where where our motor tracts, before they go down straight through the corticospinal tract, communicate with the cerebellum. They cross over, go through the opposite to the opposite side of the cerebellum in order to be coordinated, and that's how the cerebellum coordinates our movements. We're going to talk about that later in week 3, but I just want you to see here that this is where that crossing happens, okay? And when it crosses over, it goes through these big arms that go around and hug from the pons to the cerebellum, and these are called the cerebellar peduncles. This big fat one is the middle cerebellar peduncle, and we'll talk about that more. But you can see how the motor tracts start over here, cross over at this decussation of the corticocerebellar tracts, and then swing all the way around through the peduncle into the cerebellum and get processed for motor coordination. Further back, remember motor is anterior and sensory is a little bit more posterior, is the medial lemniscus. Again, we saw this up in the midbrain. This is our main, one of our main sensory tracts coming up from our body more medially as it goes up to our thalamus and somatosensory cortex. Here we have our medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is something that we haven't yet talked about, which coordinates our ability of our eyes to move in a coordinated way. It's traveling from cranial nerve 6 down here in the pons all the way up to cranial nerve 3 up in the midbrain. Those two cranial nerves, 6 and 3, have to talk to each other very efficiently in order to make our eyes move together. And that happens through the medial longitudinal fasciculus. We're going to talk about this a lot more in week 2. Here is where the facial nucleus is for cranial nerve number 7, and the abducens nucleus, cranial nerve number 6. Remember, cranial nerve number 6 is the most midline of all, and remember we talked about how cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, and 12 are very midline, as you can see here. Those are the areas of the pons that I want you to know. Here is a schematic of the pons cut so that you can see it axially. And there may be some other things mentioned here, like the dentate nucleus and other things that I don't really want you to focus on. I want you to focus on the parts highlighted here in this summary of the pontine structures. You don't need to memorize them, but this is a good list of them as we go through them over the next weeks. Finally, the medulla. The medulla, we're going to cut away the pons that sits above it, and here we are in the medulla. You can see here the bottom of the fourth ventricle. Remember how we had the aqueduct, and now the fourth ventricle is sitting right behind here before the CSF flows out, the cerebrospinal fluid flows out into the cisterns that surround the brain. Here are some important areas that I want you to know about. Anteriorly, of course, as always, are our corticospinal tracts here traveling through the medullary pyramids, this triangular structure that contains those very anterior motor tracts. Here is the spinal thalamic tract, which is the pain tract that runs up a little bit more laterally. And here is the medial lemniscus, which is the other main sensory tract, right, that brings up the vibration and proprioception fibers. So we have two different sensory tracts that we're going to talk about. We have the medial lemniscus, which brings up vibration and proprioception, and the spinal thalamic tract, which brings up pain and temperature. We're going to talk about these three tracts, the two sensory and the one motor tract, later. And this is going to be the main part of what we talk about in week 1. Okay? And in addition, we have hypoglossal nucleus, which is cranial nerve 12 nucleus, very midline. Remember, now we have seen all 4 of our very midline cranial nerve nuclei. We have cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, and 12, which are all very medial. If you injure the midline of the brainstem, you're going to hit one of those 4 nuclei and have an injury to the function of one of those 4 cranial nerves. In addition, we have a couple of other areas here. We have our reticular formation. The reticular formation is the beginning of the seat of consciousness, of where consciousness happens. And the consciousness, of course, is a really complicated set of neuronal connections. And it all starts down here in the reticular formation, goes up and spreads throughout the cortex. Just wanted to point it out here, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in week 2 when we talk about dementia and sleep conditions. Those all involve consciousness in the reticular formation. Here we have the nucleus ambiguus, which is where a lot of taste sensation comes in, and the solitary nucleus, which is involved with some of that as well. And so you can read a little bit about what these each do. So the nucleus ambiguus controls like the pharyngeal motor movements, and the nucleus solitarius controls taste sensation. So I said that incorrectly. The nucleus ambiguus controls our motor areas of our pharynx, and the nucleus solitarius controls our taste sensation. Okay? And so our cranial nerves that control taste all come together here in the solitary nucleus before bringing them up to the cortex. This is a schematic of the medulla. You can see there's a ton of different nuclei here, but I want you to just focus on the ones that we've highlighted, and we'll talk about them more in week 1 when we talk about different injuries to the medulla. All right, let's take a deep breath. We're done talking about the brainstem. These are the ventricles, which we've spoken about already, and now we're going to talk about the spinal cord. So we're done with the cerebrum, we're talking about the cerebellum, we're talking about the brainstem, and now here comes the spinal cord. The spinal cord is divided into the cervical spinal cord. That's the top that gives off the nerves that control our arms. The thoracic spinal cord, which sends off the nerves that control our thorax. And also, of course, continuing down through the thoracic spinal cord is going to be the control of our legs that ends up coming out in the lumbosacral spinal cord. Okay, the lumbosacral spinal cord is what brings information into and out of our legs and our perineum. Okay, I want to point out a couple of things. The spinal cord gives off, as you can see at each of these levels, these little nerve roots. And so these nerve roots at each level control, up in the cervical spinal cord, different parts of our arms, and there are nerve roots in the thoracic spinal cord and nerve roots down in the lumbosacral spinal cord as well. I want to point out that the nerve roots of the lumbosacral spinal cord, this lumbosacral spinal cord actually ends up at the level of the L1 and L2 vertebrae, right at that junction, okay? And so down the rest of our spine, once you're in the bottom of your spine, you're actually done with the spinal cord, and there are these long nerve roots that come down and exit at different levels of the spine, and those long nerve roots look like the tail of a horse, and that's why they're called the cauda equina. If you injure these nerve roots, you can lose complete control of your legs, your bowel, and your bladder, and so we'll talk about the cauda equina later. The conus medullaris, pointed out over here, is the very tip of the spinal cord, and it ends at L1, L2. Let's cut the spinal cord in half and in an axial plane so you can appreciate the internal architecture of the spinal cord. Unlike the cerebrum, the white matter tracts that travel down from our brain down to the rest of our body are on the outside, and the gray matter are deep inside. These are where the nuclei and the synapses happen. Okay? I want to point out some parts of the architecture here. We have the nerve roots that come out of the spinal cord. The anterior horn of the gray matter is where the motor neurons synapse and exit the spinal cord. Okay? The corticospinal tract is the first tract that we're going to talk about, which is the motor tract coming down from our motor cortex going down to the spine. It comes down laterally here, and then synapses here with the anterior ventral horn in order to exit out of the anterior nerve root. So this is the flow of motor information. It comes down through the corticospinal tract, synapses at each level of the spinal cord in the ventral horn or the anterior horn, and then that lower motor neuron exits through the ventral motor nerve root and goes out the peripheral nerve. Sensory information comes in through the back of the nerve root, the posterior nerve root, and ascends through the dorsal column to bring proprioception or position sense as well as vibration sensation. If it's bringing in pain and temperature sensation, then those neurons will synapse here in the back of the spinal cord and then go up the anterolateral tract or the spinothalamic tract. We're going to talk about that next. So this is a tutorial about all of the important structures of the central and nervous system, and we're going to talk more about the peripheral nervous system later on. But now we're going to focus on those main motor and sensory tracts.